Well, let's head back to our discussion on US Ethiopia relations going forward. We managed to get back Mr. Zemedeneh Negatu. He's the global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund. Great to have you again with us, Mr. Negatu. Now, just before we went last time, you were talking about China's influence on the continent in Ethiopia. And of course, some saying that this US trip was more about countering China's dominance in the country than stepping up US engagement in Ethiopia. Do you agree with that notion?
Well, I mean, if you heard what Secretary Pompeo said during his visit to Ethiopia, and also in the two other countries he visited, Angola and Senegal, he mentioned China, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes in a subtle way, that he's saying the U.S. model is better than the other countries, he said, which obviously meant China. Now, the point though is the United States, yes, there's some major initiatives the Trump administration has rolled out, which is the Prosper Africa, backed by $60 billion with the Development Finance Corporation. But at the end of the day, what Africans are looking for, including here in Ethiopia, is substance, okay? Is the U.S. going to fund the infrastructure that Africa needs, the roads, the airports, the bridges, and those kinds of things? Is the United States willing to finance the human capital building that Africa needs, the institutions that Africa needs, which is what China has been doing? And so for Mr. Pompeo and President Trump to be heard in a very tangible way in Africa, they need to show that there is money on the table and other initiatives that shows Africans the U.S. engagement is real. And again, he was very explicit, as I said, sometimes not. So we need to take it in that context, so especially in Ethiopia, where the growth is very substantial going forward in particular, a large country. China has been heavily engaged. If you look at the industrial parks built by the Chinese, a lot of the infrastructure by the... So I think Pompeo was saying we can engage. And to be fair to the Americans, they put in $9 billion via the IMF, the World Bank, and others. But I think an economy of this size with huge potentials going forward is going to need a bigger engagement by the end of the... Granted, there are indications that the United States will put some very substantial resources. But my view is that Ethiopia, like other African countries, being courted by the two sides is actually healthy. I think taking from China what helps these countries, including Ethiopia, and taking from the Americans and the Europeans what would help their national interest. That should be the approach, not to tell the Africans don't do deals with China. I don't think that's the way to approach this. But anyway, he was very explicit and sometimes implicit, saying be careful about China. I think that was the theme of his message across Africa and the three countries he visited, especially here yesterday in Ethiopia.
Now, very quickly, there have been a lot of mixed signals when it comes to Trump's administration's engagement with Africa. Do you think that this visit has changed any of those perceptions in terms of cooperation with Ethiopia and the rest of the continent going forward?
To be honest with you, what would change perception and the mixed messages you indicated the U.S. is sending is substance. As I said, put money on the table, engage Africans in a meaningful way, and then Africans, the perception Africans, and also, I mean, I know this might seem like an easy thing to do or to suggest, but if President Trump, for example, came and visited a few African countries, that would show respect, that would show that the United States is, because I was just looking at some numbers. The Chinese Prime Minister, the first visit he does every year of the new year is in Africa. Pompeo and his predecessor have only visited Africa, 8 or 9 countries in almost 4 years. So I think those kinds of signals, that's respect for Africa by visiting, but also backed by meaningful action, as I said earlier, will change the perception of the United States is disengaged, which in some case it has. It is disengaged from Africa. China and Africa trade is over $200 billion. U.S.-Africa trade is about $70 billion. That by itself tells you that there's a big gap to be filled. And I think these visits, while they are welcome and it shows attention, needs to be backed by substance.
Well, as always, it's great to have your insights on the show, Mr. Negatu. That was Zemedeneh Negatu, of course, the global chairman of the Fairfax Africa Fund, joining us there in Addis Ababa.